we did not manufacture much in the United States prior to 2022. And in the last 2.5 years, we have had a pretty transformational story to tell.
So it's not all about being extremely efficient. We also need to get the buy-in of the public more generally and the buy-in of policymakers.
Well, policymakers should be aware that making wafers, cells, or modules is a horrible business and they don't want it.
Energy markets are always local, and energy itself is always political. When the lights go out or energy prices soar, the whole economy and society suffers, which makes politicians part of the process. That makes these industries of the energy transition particularly prone to the whims of politicians, changes of governments, and it also makes the industry associations vitally relevant. On this episode of the podcast, I was joined by two industry association heads, Abigail Ross-Hopper, the president and CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association in the US, and Walburga Hemetsberger, the CEO of SolarPower Europe. The two of them were joined by Jenny Chase, an experienced solar analyst with BloombergNEF. And Jenny is definitely not backward in coming forward with her opinions about the political process and how that can affect solar energy storage and electrification in the US, in Europe, and right around the world. My name's Jonathan Gifford, and this is a special series of the Smarter E podcast. Hello and welcome, Abigail Ross-Hopper, Walburga Hemetsberger, and Jenny Chase. Welcome to this Powering Through podcast. This is a special series of the Smarter E podcast. Thank you very much for your time and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
Thanks
nice
for
to be here.
letting us be here.
Now, the theme of this special podcast series is resilience, powering through. How do we build a resilient solar industry, battery industry, smart electronic smart electrification movement, and including power grids, which is a big topic of conversation here in Europe at the moment. Policy, of course, plays a vital role and has been one of the building blocks of the modern solar industry and will continue to be so going forward. In terms of trade, the United States has very much been on top of the agenda in recent weeks, for better or for worse. Abigail, welcome to Europe. It's wonderful to have you here at the Smarter E. What kind of update can you give us in terms of the solar and battery storage industry in light of the tariffs that have been imposed on many countries, but in particular on China?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here with my colleagues. Thank you both. What's happening in the United States? Gosh, a lot and not much. A lot in terms of kind of policy moving and changing and maybe coming and maybe not coming and perhaps changing and perhaps not changing. And that has left the industry a bit hesitant to sort of move forward. And so we're seeing a bit of I wouldn't say a slowdown, I would say maybe just a pause, right? Like we anticipate a lot of on the congressional side, on the legislative side, a fair amount of that being finished before the end of the summer, which leaves a whole nother quarter to kind of move forward. But while we wait for that uncertainty to play itself out, I think a lot of larger companies in particular are just pressing pause. The tariffs are a whole nother story, right? The tariffs have been a bit mind-bending in terms of trying to understand not only what they do to kind of projects right now, but how do you create a procurement strategy, right? How do you know which partners to contract with? And as you're doing contract, how do you allocate that risk among off-takers and suppliers and construction firms? So that's a lot of the talk is really about risk allocation as we sort of continue to live with some pretty significant uncertainty on the tariff front.
And in terms of installations of solar and energy storage systems, I understand there's quite a lot of inventory in the US market, which particularly when it comes to storage, that will see the industry through perhaps to the end of the year. Is there potentially a bit of a cliff in terms of installations when that inventory dries up?
I think, well, Jenny might know a little more about how much inventory we have, but there certainly is I think people anticipated there would be some sort of change. So especially companies with larger balance sheets have been have a strategy of keeping a lot of inventory on in-house and in warehouses.
We reckon it's about 50 gigawatts of module inventory.
Yeah, that sounds about right. So we're, we can build for a while with that, but I don't know that I would say a cliff, but certainly maybe some significant changes in the market. But I do think that there's like, if you think about different companies and being differently situated, right, you have to have sort of a larger balance sheet to be able to stockpile some product. And I think so this is a change that is not falling equally amongst all sectors of the market.
We also know there's risks in inventory, of course, because the solar industry is one in which there's always falling prices. So it might be worth a lot less than when you bought it. In terms of storage, Jenny, I want to bring you into the conversation from BloombergNEF's perspective. The US was really one of the most promising energy storage markets globally, and we're seeing a huge impact that energy storage can have in networks, ERCOT, Texas, up in California as well. Batteries contributing a huge amount in terms of balancing the grid and shifting solar power. Is the outlook more challenging when it comes to batteries in the US market in light of the tariffs?
I think it probably is. For exactly the same reasons as it's more challenging to import solar modules. You don't know what the tariffs are going to be. You don't know where you can buy your batteries from. If you're a manufacturer, you don't know where to set up a factory. It makes everything much more Wild West, which I think, especially in the US, you're not used to. I feel like in Germany, quite often, people do buy the technology 6 weeks in advance of construction, but I don't think you do that much in the US because everything's just so much more planned and more difficult to get through. But certainly the battery tariffs are not good for continuing the US's leading position in battery deployment.
And in terms of your forecast for deployment, have you been revising downwards, I suppose?
No, we haven't actually.
Okay. Interesting.
We haven't revised them downwards, but we've not revised them upwards, which is fairly uncommon actually.
Okay. All right. Walburga, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. I heard you speaking this morning saying it's very much SolarPower Europe's position to be behind free trade when it comes to solar and battery energy storage systems. When you look at what is happening in the US, what is your takeaway in terms of trade policy and also having a partner across the Atlantic in this kind of broader energy transition?
So first of all, it's really great to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me. It's always great to exchange with you, Abigail. Yeah. It's really nice to have that opportunity. So as you said already, right, we don't know yet really what the impact will be, but it brings uncertainty. And this is not good for the energy transition. We need to go faster. We need to have certainty. We need to forge ahead. We need to grow much faster still than we do for solar. But certainly on the battery side of things, we will be publishing our battery market storage report here at Intersolar. And we will be showing that the battery market is growing, right? And that's what we need to see. But it's still far too low. We need to have, that's one of the modeling that we did, some 780 gigawatt hours of storage, battery storage by 2030. That's quite a lot. We do see that until 2029, I have the figures here, the battery storage market, according to our forecast, is growing sixfold, but we're not getting to the numbers yet that we need to see. And we do need to have much more flexibility coming from electrification, from electrifying all parts of society, industry, heating, transport, smart electrification, that we have demand response, but battery storage big times as well. So much faster, much more speed that we need to take up. And global trade uncertainties certainly do not help.
Yeah. Okay. So policy certainty, creating some kind of stability is really important for building this resilient industry and energy transition. One of the key policies in the US has been the investment tax credit over the years, and its consistency, I think, has really facilitated this stable US market expansion that we've seen. Of course, there's a big kind of cloud over the top of it at the moment with the new administration. What is your feeling in terms of the ITC and also the production tax credit as well, the PTC?
So it's funny that when you said, I mean, I knew what the title of this podcast or sort of the focus of the podcast was, but when we sat down here today and you said it, my first thought was about resiliency of policy, right? Because we could talk about the resiliency of the grid, but when we have all of this, until our policy is also resilient, it's going to continue to lead to this kind of uncertainty. It's relevant to your question because, um, as you know, the investment tax credit, it's absolutely been the bedrock of this industry. It has been a stable part, well, mostly stable. It goes up and down and up and down. But in 2022, we had a 10-year extension. So finally, for once, we had this clear pathway. Companies could invest, and it's been wildly successful, wildly successful. And it's really fun to go from sort of the theory to the practice, right? Not like, believe me when I tell you that if you do this, lawmaker, this will happen. Now I can say, you did it and it has happened, so don't mess it up. That's basically, it's a little bit more sophisticated than that, but that's the message. And so we have been lobbying hard for the last 2.5 years, basically, to make sure that policymakers understand the impact this is having on electricity prices, on the speed to market, on meeting growing electricity demand, on job creation. So I feel fairly. I always say I have informed optimism, right? Like I have conversations with Republican members of Congress every week of my life. Well, not my whole life, but in the last few years. And so I'm having those conversations behind closed doors. They understand the importance of the investment tax credit. So my optimism is informed by that. But it doesn't mean that nothing's going to change. I think we will absolutely see some changes and kind of like marks, like stamps, the Republican stamp put on the ITC. But I think that will continue to be a stable policy for the United States, based on all the conversations I'm having. I think when you pair that with the tariff, then it gets a little spicy. But the ITC alone, I think we can count on that for a few more years.
And we did see a letter from a number of 20 or 26 members of Congress, including Republican members, in support of it, which is encouraging.
21 Republican members.
Okay.
Right. And that matters, right? Because I feel weird having so much conversation about the United States, but we have a very narrow margin in both of our houses. And so a couple people, any number of people have a lot of power, right? And so 21 is a good number. I think the margin's like 2 or 3 at the moment. And so that has been really impactful. So when we're hearing there was supposed to be a markup this week, or we're here at Intersolar. So this week of Intersolar, there's supposed to be a meeting of the relevant committee to say, all right, this is how we're going to change it. And it got pushed back a week because they haven't been able to reach some consensus on that. In my opinion, that's a good sign, right? That's a good sign because it means that it's still very much up for debate.
Okay, interesting. Well, there's reasons to be hopeful, which is always a good thing. Now, Walburga was talking about battery energy storage. Jenny, I want to bring you in. We're talking about the ITC, and we know how important policy has been here in Europe. Things like the EEG, which is celebrating an anniversary just this year, actually, in terms of driving demand. What kind of policy support do you think could be helpful in terms of enabling more storage deployment, battery energy storage deployment here in Europe, which, as Walburga said, is just so crucial?
Well, first of all, the EEG and the feed-in tariffs are done. They did their job. We've got cheap solar. It was not a very smart policy, but it was generous, and it is the reason why this is a big event and not being held in a shed somewhere. But we have to move beyond that because the challenge these days, solar panels are freaking everywhere. Seriously, you look at Google Earth and at some random area of Pakistan and you see solar panels everywhere. And this is causing challenges as well as huge opportunities. And so the next step is to figure out how to integrate that into grids and to figure out how to make sure that the batteries that we've got in the grid play nicely with the grids. So I think that we've got to build batteries and we've got to make sure that they are charging when there's lots of sun and discharging when it is the best to support the grid, which a lot of electricity pricing regimes in Europe don't do at the moment. A lot of electricity pricing regimes are flat or have cheaper power at night, and that's not necessarily what our new energy transition ready grid wants them to be doing. So I would say something like CapEx subsidies for batteries, that's what gets them built, and then quite flexible electricity pricing to make sure that those batteries have an incentive to charge and discharge at the best times. I was quite encouraged to go to the UK and see adverts for Octopus Energy, which has a really flexible power pricing regime everywhere. It was quite weird to see my job everywhere, but it's definitely making an impact on the average UK person.
Yeah, that is interesting because it used to be this kind of mega geeky thing, right? We need flexible tariffs. We need to align demand with kind of renewable production, and seeing that kind of being pushed into the mainstream by a fast growing retailer is really encouraging. Walburga, in terms of these battery deployments, just taking a step back, what is your message for European policymakers?
Let me really take a step back, because it sounded a little bit that we have too much solar already because we have it on all roofs. I would question that. We still need to go faster. So even if we see it on many roofs today, we still need to, be at 70, 80 gigawatt of additional capacity every year now, going forward to reach the 750 gigawatt that we promised European policymakers to install by 2030. And indeed, battery will be helping. I very much agree with you that we need to look at the incentive structure. What we do see is that, for example, time of use tariffs are greatly helping, but we only see that in a couple of countries by now. So we have 11 countries. I think that's the latest figures that ASA published. 11 countries that have time of use tariffs for TSO and the DSO level. 8 countries for the DSO level. So we need to see that everywhere. And I couldn't agree more with the funding that will help, obviously, CapEx funding. We saw the storage market going through the roof in Italy with the schemes that they had in the last couple of years. So this is what we need to see a little bit everywhere in order to add the flexibility with storage that we need in the system. And now I forgot your question, I think.
No, I was looking at what are you telling the European policymakers?
European policymakers, yes. Number one ask is that we need a European storage action plan. In the last 5 years, you've been talking about policies that were really very helpful in the US. The last 5 years, we had the Green Deal. We had the Fit for 55 package, a lot of helpful regulation that is already providing on the European level quite some helpful tools for storage to take up. That, for example, battery storage, non-fossil storage needs to have a place in capacity markets, for example, and so on and so on. So there's a couple of really useful regulation, but now it needs to be implemented, and we don't see that being implemented already at the scale that we need. So we need an action plan. A storage action plan as part of a broader flexibility package. And this is what we are asking policymakers. They need to make sure that grid connection is easier for batteries. We see, for example, that hybrid systems could play an enormously beneficial role. We just came up with a report on hybrid systems, connecting solar and storage, connecting solar wind. But they're hampered in many, many member states because you have already number 200 megawatt connected to a certain grid connection point. That's the maximum capacity. So you're not allowed to add storage, which could help the grid. So these are the kind of things that need to change, a faster grid connection. And then obviously providing the possibility for batteries to create revenues on different markets. There needs to be a fair market access also for batteries. And we need to make sure that the action plan is covering these kind of points.
Yeah, these revenue streams are vital. And we've seen in Europe ancillary services markets being a really big driver of energy storage.
They're shallow, though.
That's
the problem.
But in the UK, we've seen, that really helps storage get off the ground, right? It gets it to scale.
It does. But once you start playing in the big league on the grid, which both solar and batteries are starting to do. We're not small anymore. That's why we're having problems, which is great. But it's
nice
also
problems to have.
they start cannibalizing. So ancillary service markets are really shallow, which means that once the first few batteries make lots of money selling frequency regulation services, but then the next few batteries make less because the frequency is already being regulated quite well.
Yeah, but there can be, all right, I'm trying to play devil's advocate. There can also be, as you get bigger spreads, intraday spreads, and very high peak prices and very low, it can be part of the puzzle.
Market.
Yeah, that's the arbitrage market. You can kind of stack up those revenues in a way that's really attractive.
Yes, you can. It's also super risky. But yes, I mean, that's a case where solar drives big power price spreads in the day, and then batteries smooth out that spread. And so hopefully there's some kind of virtuous circle there.
Yeah, and you also hopefully can see as the batteries scale that they start to draw down on that solar, confront that or overcome that cannibalization, make it possible to keep installing solar. Let's pivot a little bit to manufacturing. I would like to address that just because I think part of the reason that we do have these Republican lawmakers that are backing the ITC or that are pro-solar is that we're seeing quite a lot of manufacturing jobs throughout the solar supply chain in the US in red districts. And how important do you think that has been for kind of broader support in the face of party politics in the US?
I think it's been pretty phenomenal and really important in terms of building support. There have been not only sort of module manufacturing, but there have been a ton of balance of systems. So a lot of inverter manufacturers, tracker manufacturers, wire manufacturers, just a number of things that perhaps some legislators didn't even potentially realize were part of the solar and storage supply chain. We use a lot of US-made steel, partly because we have to as some of the requirements of the IRA. And so we have a number of steel manufacturers now in the United States who are very pro-renewable energy because we're their customers. And that has been really impactful, right, for members of Congress who now say, oh, like I'm a strong believer that all the politics is local. And so when you bring job creation and tax revenue and investment into a district, into a congressional district, in this case, members start to see it and understand it and appreciate it. And so that has been a game changer. And again, it's sort of the theory from reality. Like we did not manufacture much in the United States prior to 2022. And in the last 2.5 years, we have had a pretty transformational story to tell. Billions and billions of dollars of investment. We now can manufacture all of our own module supply. Is that the end of the story? No, but it's a strong, strong beginning. And again, so when people like me are lobbying legislators, I don't have to say, well, guess what could be? I get to say, well, look what's happening in your district. If your constituents, the people that vote for you, their jobs are now dependent on this.
And how is the kind of more general uncertainty in the marketplace affecting these manufacturers? Because as you say, there was a big build out of module capacity.
Yeah.
Cell capacity is considerably more CapEx
following.
intensive and coming, but it's a very big decision, right?
Yes.
You can set up a module fab relatively easily.
Yeah.
In a garage.
In a garage.
Yeah.
If you want to. I mean, if you want a good one, you do have to spend some money.
Yeah.
But a cell factory is a different story.
Right.
Is the uncertainty having an impact on this build out?
So I testified the other day in front of our International Trade Commission, and I testified we have 50 gigawatts of module capacity, 2 gigawatts of cell capacity. So that just gives you a sense of the scale of the differential. I would say at the moment, if folks haven't broken ground, they've sort of hit the pause button, right, to let things play out on the ground and see whether the manufacturing incentives will continue and to see whether the demand pull continues. So yeah, I mean, people are waiting a bit to make that next decision, right? There's like a series of decisions you make on an investment, and I think there's a lot of pause happening at the moment.
And on a policy level, stepping back a little bit, in terms of how do you encourage continued deployment of solar and batteries, and how do you also foster your domestic industry? It's always a bit of a conundrum, also for industry associations, because you have members right across the supply chain. Jenny, I want you to kind of join this. We'll add to this part of the conversation or debate. What's your take? Deployment over manufacturing. How do policymakers walk that line?
Well, policymakers should be aware that making wafers, cells, or modules is a horrible business, and they don't want it. Making inverters, making balance of system, those are somewhat more specialized products, and it's possible, and there are barriers to entry, and therefore it's possible to have a good product for the local market. But modules, it's just a loss-making business, and it's delusional to think you can make money out of it, particularly for a wafer, cell, or module factory in Europe. Okay, the US, you pay like stupid amounts for your modules, so maybe you can make money with the trade barriers, but it's still not a nice business. So I suppose what policymakers think is that they want this business, but they shouldn't think that.
But yeah, that's the other side, though, as we were saying
But
before.
here we are.
As we were saying before, it's the just transition, it's job creation, it's getting support from local members. Maybe that will be the support that the industry needs to push the energy transition forward. Walburga, from a European perspective, it's a tricky issue to navigate.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, what we have been showing in the last couple of years is indeed jobs. A lot of jobs that have been created through deploying solar. We have 800,000 jobs in Europe. I agree with you that having also manufacturing is something that politicians, that people more generally are very sensitive to. So it is a very, very strong argument to have manufacturing that can then also help, get the buy-in of those whom you wouldn't have convinced yet for the energy transition. So it is a strong argument. I agree with you that inverters is something that we are focusing at the moment on. But I do think, resilience more generally is also a value that policymakers should acknowledge. And the US has done so with the IRA really pushing for manufacturing in the US. So it's not all about being extremely efficient. We also need to get the buy-in of the public more generally and the buy-in of policymakers. And we have seen just lately that supply chains, can have, there could be problems coming up in supply chains. So being resilient is just something prudent to do. And this is why we've been very much supporting manufacturing, bring it back to Europe along the whole supply chain. So the 30 gigawatt target of the European Union is something that we are very much supporting, but we didn't have the same means yet as the IRA was providing. We have some very first steps that are taken with the Net Zero Industry Act, where we have some bonus points that governments should give to locally produced products. We need to still see that rolling out, but where we still have deficiency clearly, and this is where the IRA really has done a good job, is on the financing side. So without proper financing, so you cannot only have demand pull, but you also need to have some push measures. Financing, operational financing is something that we're still missing. And this is why we haven't seen the take-up, even if we have taken measures in Europe, we haven't seen the same take-up yet as you have seen in the United States.
Yeah, but I think this goes back to the resiliency idea. I mean, you just mentioned it, sort of. In a world where there were no potential barriers, either caused by global pandemics or political fights, or even just like for us, sometimes we have strikes at our ports, right? And so it is not, we're not always able to get everything as if it were sort of a seamless system. And so building some resiliency in our supply chain so that even if it may not be the most efficient from a pure economic point of view, it is wise to do it for sort of this resiliency. That has been there has been value, as you just said. There has been value in building some of that manufacturing capacity in-house, basically in country, so that we have not had to sort of navigate some of those challenges that we did like in the 2021.
But maybe where I would what I would add is, because you also asked in the beginning, is that from our perspective, tariffs, and we've been very outspoken, is a complete lose-lose strategy, at least when we look at Europe. So at this, building that resilience is extremely important, but it's also even as important than building resilience is to keep the global trade open and not close the borders with tariffs. So this is something that we continue to uphold and continue to convey to policymakers. This is not the time for tariffs.
Well, we saw here in Europe those anti-dumping tariffs. When was that? Maybe 10 years ago, 8 years ago, or something like that. And were really not effective, as Walburga alludes to, in terms of supporting local manufacturers. But it does add all these kind of lumps to the market, to the supply chain, and strange things go on. Jenny, do you see these kind of interventionist trade measures? What kind of end market impact do they have, and can they be effective in terms of supporting manufacturing?
I've never seen them be effective.
And do they
well,
slow down
I suppose
deployment?
the US trade barriers have really helped manufacturers in Southeast Asia until suddenly they didn't. I think they really slow down deployment, I'll be honest, because you've got to hire a whole bunch of people to keep track of what's got tariffs on it now and what's likely to get tariffs on it now. Right now, everyone's building their cell and module factories in Indonesia and Laos but everyone knows that the US is going to slap tariffs on Indonesia and Laos next. So I think it's a sort of desperation measure more than anything else. Also, you can put a cell factory on a boat and ship it over if you really want to do things quickly. But it's
an interesting idea.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that yet, Jenny.
It's the Wild West out there.
Yeah.
The PV industry is very ingenious about getting around tariffs and making sure that the supply chains continue to deliver. But it definitely has slowed down build in the US since 2012. And it briefly caused a bit of a wobble in the European market. The anti-dumping duties were never particularly stringent. And
it was a complete disaster when we had the tariffs. 2011, 28 until 2018, when they were lifted, it was a complete desert in the solar space when we had the tariffs. And then only afterwards the market took up again. But tariffs were really detrimental to our sector. And this is where we can show history has proven that this is the wrong way, and we need to really make sure that we don't have these barriers anymore. I mean, there was because you're looking at me, there was other things as well.
It wasn't the only reason the market
It was not
fell.
the only reason, but it was a very important reason because it brought a lot of uncertainty. Another reason was that, and that was the main reason, why we were slowing down to start with, was that incentive schemes were taken back. But that, had the whole process starting, that the industry was moving. Then we got the tariffs; it didn't bring the industry back, and we were in a very bad position. And only when we lifted it, we were able to. The market was taking up again.
That's very much the impact of unstable policy or sudden policy changes. And I really wanted this discussion to be about building a resilient policy basis. So perhaps as a final thought, I'd like to get your input. What would be your kind of closing thought for how do we build resilient policy to support the energy transition from a European perspective, Walburga?
So first of all, maybe coming back to one of the things you alluded to in the very beginning, first of all, what we should not do is blame anything on renewables like the blackout in Spain and Portugal, because it is clear that there's big economies running on renewables without any problems. We need to build resilient systems. We talked about resilience in the manufacturing space, but what I mean is energy systems. And resilient energy systems are systems that come with flexibility, that come with a lot of storage, and with the grids that we need, obviously. But all of that should help get the right infrastructure together that can support energy system that is based on renewables and that is bringing all the benefits. So the policymakers really need to focus on that resilience of the system and doing the right things. And the blackout really has shown that we're not talking about resilience theoretically. And now it's time for action. It's an inflection point. And now we need to really act fast in order to make our systems resilient so that we can bring the benefits of the energy transition to industries, to households, and really reshape the way we're looking at energy.
So a system level approach, not only one industry or
Absolutely.
one part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Abigail, what would you say from the Solar Energy Industry Association in the US?
Well, I would agree with what Walburga said, and I would also sort of lean into this idea of building political resiliency. We talked about the system itself, but also kind of to have stable policy, you have to have buy-in, right, for that policy. And so it is more about storytelling and making sure that lawmakers and citizens understand the impact that solar and storage is having, not just on jobs, but also on prices and bringing down electricity prices. The other thing that it's interesting, we didn't talk about here, but every interview I do in the United States is about rising electricity demand. Rising electricity demand, and rising electricity demand, and how are we going to meet that demand? And in the United States, it's with solar and storage. It's the fastest way that we can do that. And that narrative and that reality also brings some stability to the policy because it is a market force that is driving the conversation as opposed to sort of a technology choice or like a climate decision. It's like, if you, United States, if you want to continue to maintain be at the forefront of the AI dominance, which is what our president says, you have to provide reliable, stable electricity. In order to do that, you have to figure out the cheapest, fastest, and that's solar and storage. So it's a little bit of a different take on your question, but I think it's a really important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, the imperative to deploy. And like Jenny said, you can just whack solar panels everywhere, as people are doing. Jenny, from the analyst perspective, what have you seen as being really successful policies? What are the most resilient policies to support the energy transition?
Well, one of the big problems with solar policy in the past has been that it's been set too generously for the current level of the current costs of solar. There's been a huge boom. Governments have panicked and just pulled it all back. And that's the opposite of stable policy. So I'm going to be slightly unpopular again by saying that a good stable policy is probably errs on the side of being slightly too ungenerous rather than too generous. Because the solar industry is extremely industrious and clever and can get things built if the economics are a bit marginal or they have to do smart stuff. And then they wouldn't have to deal with these incredible boom and bust cycles. And right now, we do need to focus on what the grid needs to be resilient and to usefully use all this great solar power they're getting whenever it's sunny.
Jenny Chase from BloombergNEF. A good message there. Thank you very much for joining. Also, thank you, Abigail Ross-Hopper from SEIA and Walburga Hemetsberger from the SolarPower Europe. Thank you very much for joining our podcast, Powering Through today. I'm Jonathan Gifford, the head of content for Climate Copy. Thank you for watching.